All right. Thank you very much. Well, I guess while cameras get turned on for the other two panelists, we can begin. So thank you for having me. Thank you for having us. Thanks to the organizers for putting together this wonderful panel. So the talk today is about role of technology and AI in advancing the sustainable development goals, with a particular focus on perspectives from Asia and the US. So I think we're all in agreement that technology and AI can advance the SDGs in a number of dimensions. We just heard about, for instance, climate, and of course, science and technology policy will play an important role in helping us put this pandemic behind us. I think what we've got coming up in store right now for this panel, we've got experts in 3 dimensions, and I'm going to prompt the experts in these dimensions, but of course, if they want to go off on their own, in their own direction, we would welcome it. First, we'll have Renata Dessallien, who's the resident coordinator for the UN in India. She has 35 years of experience working in development, especially with a focus across South Asia, and she's engaged in several AI-related efforts right now. I'm personally particularly keen to hear about how technology can support employment and labor opportunities for India, and I know you've been doing a lot with the Indian government in that space. Of course, if you would like to talk about some of the other initiatives taking place under your leadership, I think we would all love to hear about that as well. Then we will have Rajesh Gopakumar. He's the director at the International Center for Theoretical Sciences in Bangalore. He's an IIT Kanpur undergrad and a Princeton PhD graduate. That's cheering for my alma mater. He's a topological string theory expert. I would love to hear what topological string theory actually is. However, I think on this panel, Rajesh is probably in a unique vantage to speak about education fundamental research more generally, especially in the context of the SDGs. I would invite any kinds of comments on that. And then Professor Richard Dasher, he heads the Stanford's US Asia Tech Management Center, and he advises several AI-focused startups. As opposed to the UN expert and the academic, Richard Dasher has his foot actually, I guess, in both areas, academia as well as the private sector. And he can talk with us about the role that the private sector can play in advancing tech and AI towards the sustainable development goals. And I should mention, he also brings in perspective from East Asia and balances out the panel with the US perspective as well. So with that, let's go in order. Renata, would you like to begin?
Sure. Thanks so much, Dinsha. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're coming in perfectly.
Great. Okay, so warm greetings from the United Nations in India, and special thanks to Stanford Basis for putting together this really important summit and for inviting me. Really happy about that. I'd like to kick off by just saying a few words about AI as an SDG accelerator, and then address the need for guardrails, and particularly ethical guardrails. I think, first of all, the discovery of deep learning, unleashed this exponential set of experimentation around the world. We've seen so many mushrooming of apps in almost every sector now that you can imagine. And in that context, AI has really been used to expedite SDG progress. And I want to give you a couple of really concrete examples. They're not, one of them is from India, but they're not all from India. They're based on developing country experience. First is in the area of infant and child malnutrition. Listeners may know that about 47 million children under the age of 5 are wasted, nutritionally speaking, and 3.1 million of them die every year from undernutrition. SDG 2, which is about zero hunger, and SDG 3, which is about good health, were created to tackle this. And the old way of knowing about a child's nutritional status was through physical anthropometric measurement tools. And it worked well, but it involved handling the child, which the child did not always appreciate. There were hygienic issues as well. It required equipment, so it was clumsy. And records were not always very accurately kept, particularly in remote areas. And here in India, the Wadhwani Foundation recently rolled out a virtual weighing AI technology in rural areas using smartphones. So basically, photos are taken of the child by phone. They're fed into a database with other parameters, of course, and the nutritional status of the child is generated basically within seconds. And of course, the information is then fed back to the rural areas so that they can take action on it. It's really hugely promising in terms of accuracy, in terms of timeliness, and in terms of reliable record keeping. So that's one example from India. Another example is in the area of clean water, which is SDG 6. As you well know, water scarcity is a big challenge in some parts of India and many other parts of the world as well. And the World Economic Forum estimated that between 25 and 30% of piped water is lost just due to leakages. But with the assistance of smart water sensors that are installed in pipes to monitor the flow of water, huge savings can be made. So an example of this is Takadu, which is a company based in Israel, and it's created a cloud-based solution connecting water pipe data to the Internet of Things. And it enables the detection of blockages, weaknesses in the piping, and damages so corrective action can be taken. And in Queensland, Australia, Unity Water used Takadu and the cloud-based system to basically cut its water losses through leakages by 1 billion liters a year. And the examples of AI's potential to accelerate SDG progress just go on and on and on. Whether we're talking about energy efficiency, crop yields, pest control, TB treatment, cancer and other disease diagnostics, it just goes on and on. Many of these experiments are actively supported by the United Nations, and I wanted to encourage your viewers to visit the ITU website, International Technology Union website, and look for their AI for Good Summit page, because there's a whole list of really interesting work going on there. A study was published in Nature magazine reviewing the impact of AI on SDGs, and it found that AI could enable 134 of the SDG targets. So clearly, I think we're on the cusp of an unprecedented tech breakthrough with huge promise for social and economic progress. However, and I wanted to underscore the however, the same Nature study found that AI could hinder 59 of the SDG targets. And like other technological breakthroughs, AI obviously comes with risks, and it's recently met with some pretty serious public scrutiny. Some of the concerns include things like, for example, the digital divide and the widening of inequalities. AI can easily replicate existing inequalities, and of course, it can create its own disparities. And Dinsha, you mentioned about the issue of jobs. Job displacement through AI is obviously a big concern, probably even a bigger concern than previous technological revolutions. We're talking not only about blue collar worker jobs, but also white collar worker. And I think that, this simplistic approach that you can sort of reskill these people for the new digital age is probably misplaced. I think we're going to really need to think out of the box much big more. So I feel, quite frankly, that the risk of growing inequalities alongside this incredible progress for humanity is going to be one of the big risks. But there are also a litany of other kinds of risks, and I'll just list them without going into them because in the interest of time. There's this issue of data, personal data, confidentiality, how our personal data is being used without our consent or with perfunctory consent that nobody really understands that they're actually giving when they click the agree button. There's the use of our digital footprints, the harvesting and selling of it. Who owns this data? Who should own it? There's some fascinating experimentation going around on data commons or ideas about data commons, data trusts. Here in India, there's a data trust experiment going on using secondary data on people's transport movements in order to try to render the public transport system more efficient. There's the issue of digital addiction, which I could go on for hours and hours about. In addition to the digital sort of gimmicks like clicks and infinite scroll and streaks and all those kinds of gimmicks, there's actually AI programmed mechanisms. They are designed to keep us engaged. They're designed to grab our attention, keep our attention, sell our attention, and then filter us into echo chambers, and which has a whole range of issues related to our own individual well-being. It erodes common ground in our society. It's even having, I think, impacts to some extent on societies overall and our democratic systems. There's the issue of bias. I won't go into that because I think they're well covered by the media, but many well-known AI apps, of course, it's still teething time, so I don't want to badmouth them too much, but many of them have shown to be biased, either because of the algorithm or because of the training data that they're using. And then again, no time to go into it, but the whole issue of autonomous weapons is of obviously serious concern. And then whether it's a concern or not, given where we are in terms of the development of AI, the whole issue of singularity, and this point in time where at some point intelligent machines may actually exceed human intelligence. And what does that mean for humanity? And what does that mean for human life and agency and all these, one might say esoteric, but I think some people are still quite concerned about it. So these are all very, very, very real risks, I think, and it's led to some questioning and quite a bit of hand wringing, you might say. And I think that's absolutely normal. And then one would be surprised if it hadn't, because any tech revolution brings about, major changes in our lifestyle and how we live and even how we think about things. So the million-dollar question is, how do we preserve the space for creative, innovative flourishing of AI for the common good, and at the same time mitigate some of the very real potential risks? So to inspire and to guide some of the thinking on this, our UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres pulled together a group to advise him on, how could the UN bring the international community together around this. And they came up with a number of recommendations, which were then transformed into what's called the Roadmap for Digital Cooperation. And again, I just sort of encourage those of you who are interested in this. It's on the website. It's easy to see. It's comprehensive. It deals with everything from some of the risks that I've just run through to a number of other things. And as I said, again, the whole purpose is to try to bring the international community together on this, because of course AI is probably, those who make success in terms of AI innovation are the ones who are going to be leading the world. And so cooperation is not always the easiest thing to come by. Secondly, UNESCO has developed a comprehensive set of recommendations for ethical and responsible use of AI. And that is now shared with its 193 member states who are deliberating over it now. We hope by the end of the year it may be adopted. It's extremely important, I think, because AI and its applications know no boundaries, no border boundaries, and therefore our approach to striving to ensure that AI is used ethically and responsibly similarly has to, follow a harmonized approach. And then lastly, on the ground, there are many UN agencies that are working very, very hard now with member state governments, with other partners, private sector, with think tanks, to both help develop AI to accelerate SDG progress, and at the same time, try to internalize these ethical principles that have been rolled out by UNESCO. Many others have rolled out similar kinds of ethical principles as well. So I'll end up here in the interest of time, and I want to compliment you, Richard, on your backdrop, which is lovely with the arches behind you, and just say how pleased I am to be able to discuss this with you today. And once again, warm congratulations on the summit.
Thank you. Rajesh, would you like to go next?
Hi. Yeah, thanks, Dinsha. And it's great to be here as part of this global summit, joining in from Bangalore. And particular thanks to Radhika, Anu, and Lucas for putting together such a stellar program and stimulating talks. I'm not sure how long I'll be able to go into the night with this, but it's certainly something very compelling. Let me share a few slides that I prepared. It's not going to be very long, just just 4 of them. So so I hope you can see the screen now. Yeah, I'll try to bring in a certain perspective as a scientist, as Siddharth Chatterjee just said in the previous session. It's the job of, he quoted Bernard Shaw, but about dreaming of the things that uh, could be and say, why not? So in some sense, that's sort of the scientist's job to perhaps see a little bit ahead. And I thought I'd try to bring in that perspective and why science, I feel, and particularly basic sciences, which are often seen as a bit removed from immediate applications and so on, why it's nevertheless very critical to attaining things like the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's, of course, the obvious answer that science is often viewed as a solution provider for many of the problems in the Sustainable Development SDGs, and I've just listed a few of them. And I'm sure, and we just heard from Renata about some of these issues being tackled. I will share a few vignettes, primarily from India, from contexts that I'm familiar with, how fundamental science, basic sciences can actually provide very strong input, particularly in some of the first, my examples will be in the first 2 or 3 of this. At the same time, as a scientist, I'm also very well aware, and I think it's worth pointing out about the pitfalls of sort of over-scientism, so to say, which, because science has a tendency in attacking problems to approach it from a very highly reductionist point of view. So excessive reductionism and sometimes decontextualizing, because after all, these are problems embedded in a certain social, economic, political context. And looking at things apart from that can sometimes lead to disastrous results. And I think there have been many cautionary examples in the past. So that's something I would like to just highlight over there, while at the same time celebrating the ability of science to do a number of wonderful things. There's another aspect which is probably a little less talked about in this context, is science as method, not just as solution provider. And science, the scientific method, in a sense, provides a way to make judgment calls, and often judgment calls based on imperfect or incomplete information. And this is something increasingly we are seeing as we tackle globally complex problems, that we need to do that. And how do we kind of make the best call based on things that we still don't completely understand or partially know about? And another point I wanted to put out there is that there's another important role that I think science can play at the institutional level, as opposed to individual scientists and their research, which is of basic science institutions. Science is a global enterprise, and global knowledge sharing, global collaborations very naturally can be brought together by existing global science institutions, and probably more of them dedicated to that. So these are sort of general remarks, and let me share 2 vignettes and a sort of a dream. So the first one is regarding the monsoon, which is, of course, as all of you probably know, at least for the people of South Asia, it is something very critical to their economic well-being. But it's at the same time a scientifically very challenging question of understanding, predicting its patterns, understanding its variations, because no year is like any other, and the pattern of rainfall across India and its sort of dry spells and the wet spells are very important for the agricultural cycles, etc. And at ICTS, even though we are a very theoretical institution, but we feel we can make an impact in this, and we've brought together an initiative which brings together physicists, mathematicians, computer scientists to model rainfall patterns. And amazingly, you can find that 110 years of rainfall data sort of fall into 10 of these patterns, which I've shown over here. I don't have time to, of course, go into all the details, but that's an example, I think, how sophisticated physical, mathematical techniques enhanced with artificial intelligence tools that we now have can really make, I think, a concrete impact, which we'll hopefully see. The second one has, which I wanted to highlight here, was biodiversity, and which is, of course, again, one of the SDGs. And here again, I think fundamental insights from modern biology can play an important role. And ICTS is part of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research system. And our sister center here in Bangalore, the National Center for Biological Sciences, is one of the leaders in this in India. And they have this chemical ecology group, which has brought insights from fundamental biology into a number of questions, and I've just listed a few of them: DNA studies of tiger migration, butterfly senses, in fact, again, involving citizen science and AI apps, plant responses to environment, savanna ecology, and so on. It's a kind of a new type of science they're trying to create here, and in which fuses ecological, analytical, and computational approaches. And it's the sort of thing that I think motivated, passionate scientists, when you bring them to tackle some of these questions, the kind of new insights they can bring into the subject. And finally, this is not something particular to India. I just wanted to highlight over there, and we just heard Dieter Jorgensen from talking about the Energy New Deal, but there's the idea of artificial photosynthesis, I think, is something which I feel deserves much more of a global initiative. And this was precisely what this paper I've highlighted here sort of really kind of advocates: a global project to kind of understand photosynthesis, because after all, plants are capturing carbon, they are generating energy in a very efficient way throughout the world. And if we just can biomimic that system in some ways, I think we will be both solving problems of clean energy as well as of carbon capture. And so that's, I think, a dream which I think it's a global challenge, and the global science community needs to come together with the support of governments across the world to bring something like this about. So this is just sort of a set of vignettes and a vision, a sort of a wish list of things that one could do. So I'd be very keen to hear the perspectives of others, Richard, and the people in the Q&A as well on this. But I believe strongly that fundamental science, basic sciences, have a very important role to play in the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
Thank you. I would encourage everybody, if you've got questions, to please put them in the Q&A. This panel will wrap up at around 10 a.m. Pacific time, so in about 20 minutes. So if you have questions, it'll be a lot easier if they're already in the queue when we start. With that, Richard, please, with the beautiful...
Okay, thank you very much, Dinsha. And thanks everyone for getting together this morning. I'm going to try to bring in the perspectives of the private sector into this discussion. Remember, this program is organized by BASES, which is really a business association of Stanford students, and the Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs, which is all about startup companies. The first thing we have to recognize is that, yes, as Renata has mentioned, we are in an era of incredibly great change. Thanks to the World Economic Forum, the term Fourth Industrial Revolution has been popularized a lot. If you really think about what that involves, the first industrial revolution is the one we think about, mechanization, from the late 1700s into the 1800s. The second industrial revolution was really taking the machines and using them in new ways with new tools, using them for assembly line manufacturing and the spread of new kind of energy systems. So the third industrial revolution is usually considered to be the spread of digital information technology, the spread of technology. And we are now in the early mid stages of this fourth revolution, which is about new tools. And one of the most important new tools right now is artificial intelligence. But you see some other new tools like blockchain. You see other tools on the horizon like quantum computing. And these new tools, unfortunately, with any revolution, change never happens at a unified pace. Some people move forward, some people are resistant to change. And what happens in a revolution is that inequalities tend to be exacerbated so that there are the winners and the losers. In some ways, the COVID-19 problem last year accelerated this. Look at what happened in the retail industry. Companies like Target and Walmart that did a lot of online business did extremely well, whereas traditional high-end department stores went bankrupt. So you see that this kind of inequality is unfortunately a big tendency of any kind of period of change. Now, if you look at what we're trying to focus on today with the Sustainable Development Goals, those goals really are focused in three main areas. One is improvements to quality of life. Two is inclusiveness, because without inclusive improvements to quality of life, this inequality will get worse and worse. Look what happened after the Second Industrial Revolution. We had 2 world wars. So we have to move on. And the third area, of course, is sustainability, environmental sustainability, sustainability of institutions, sustainability of the quality of life that we're aiming at. When most people are talking about technologies, they're really talking about what you can do with the new tools. So finding uses of the new tools that will improve inclusiveness or that will improve sustainability or quality of life is one of the major tasks that society has and one of the major opportunities that entrepreneurs and other business people have. I love the examples that have been given before. Renata, example of this startup company that's looking at measurements of child nutrition level. That was not possible before these new technologies. So there are a lot of things. It's probably significant that the SDG about inequality just says reduce inequality. It doesn't say eliminate it. But if you're aiming at reducing inequality, improving opportunity is where a lot of businesses are aiming. So you see educational technology as a major area of development. Some really interesting things using AI in educational technology. You see AI being used to improve access to healthcare, as well as the quality of the healthcare that's going on. Improvements to safety. It is true that the digital divide is one of these areas that is splitting apart, and we need to have focus on this. In order to bring the private sector into this discussion, though, you have to have both, well, the 17th Sustainable Development Goal is new partnerships to achieve the goals. So the industry has to play along. Industry has to be part of this. This means that investors have to make a return on their money. It means that entrepreneurs who start companies or people who join startup companies have to be incentivized, or they will not take the extra risk. So we need to keep focused on these kinds of practical aspects of improving inclusivity. I think that in closing, I would have to say that without the private sector, we have a lot of danger of public policy that just will not change people's lives. You must meet top-down policy decisions, new ways of looking at the economy, with bottom-up ways from the business side, where people see an improvement for all of those around them. Most entrepreneurs want to change the world for better. They want to do something that will improve people's lives. As long as we have a big picture of the need for inclusiveness and sustainability, the entrepreneurs will continue to be motivated in the right way. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So as I mentioned, the Q&A is open for anybody who would like to participate. I'd like to kick it off just by asking a question about these guardrails to technology and AI. Where should these guardrails come from? Should we be turning to states for these kinds of protections against technology abuses? Should we expect the private sector to regulate itself? Should we be expecting multilateral institutions to step in, maybe academics to only do responsible science? Where should we be thinking about that? I'll invite Renata to come in, and then Richard and Rajesh, if you want to participate as well, please.
Sure. So I think, I think all of the above, quite frankly. I think really, quite frankly, right now, well, clearly there's an AI race going on globally. And clearly countries feel strongly that, well, many countries feel strongly that, in order to make it, so to speak, in the brave new world, they're going to have to excel in the area of AI and some of these other breakthrough areas that Richard outlined. So on the one hand, there's a desire to succeed. On the other hand, you can already see some backlash from society, right? And I think that there's a strong need for, well, first of all, I think that the period moving ahead will be a bit messy, because nobody really has the how should I say, the recipe for the response. Clearly, responsibility is in the hands of the private sector. Clearly, responsibility is in the hands of the public sector, and clearly, responsibility is in the hands of private citizens who are the beneficiaries or users of it. And clearly, there's responsibility in academia. So I think everybody's going to have to pull their part. In different parts of the world, we will see it unfolding in different ways. In some parts of the world, the state may play a stronger role. In other parts of the world, the private sector will maybe just naturally play a bigger role. But there's no question in my mind that everyone's going to have to play a role. Everyone has a responsibility here. And I think that the private sector, because it's in the lead right now, not in every country, but in certainly in America, Europe, etc., and other parts of the world, a large responsibility is on their shoulders now to try to get it right at the beginning. And you can see their efforts being made to self-regulate, right? You see their efforts being made to try to clarify what these principles are. The problem that I see is that it's not so hard to come up with a set of laudable principles, but it's really hard to apply them. And AI is so, how should I say, take any sector, take the health sector, take the education sector, any sector. The uses of AI are so different. So you can't just have a sector-wide approach to AI. You have to customize it to the actual application. And you have to be really careful, if you're a state, that you try to oversee the implementation of the principles that you'd like to see upheld, or that society would like to see upheld, without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So it's a really, really delicate balance that nobody has the right answer to. So I think there's going to be a lot of experimentation. There's probably will be a moment where governments overregulate and then have to pull back again. And there will be a lot of mistakes made by the private sector as well, because the thing is that we're calling for transparency and accountability and explainability of some of these algorithmic applications. And I think coders will even tell you, before deep learning or machine learning, they could probably explain it very well. But afterwards, the whole point is that the machine is actually learning constantly, and coders won't be able to explain it all. So it's fine to have a nice principle out there, but if it's not, how should I say, if it can't be technically, how should I say, implemented, then you have a problem. So it's going to be messy, but I think, if we all sort of put our best foot forward and expect that we're going to make some mistakes globally and in every country, I sort of have faith that, this new technology will serve humanity well, but it won't be without some small and probably some very big mistakes, simply because it's so new and nobody really knows the answer to your question, except all of the above.
I would pick up on what Renata says and say that all sectors have to be involved. That's absolutely right. and each sector should do what that sector does best. So the one thing that I think we're missing is an incentive from somewhere. Maybe it's from the people through their governments, maybe it's through international organizations, to speed up the process of developing standards. Because certainly companies will want to have standards for their own purposes, but to them, establishing a standard is more of a cost. Now, actually, big companies trying to turn their business into platform businesses are all about making their technology the standard. So they see that for their own benefit, and they're trying to do that very, a great deal. But who's going to represent the small companies, the companies that are left out, the platform dependent startup companies? That can be another issue. International organizations are essential. A lot of those are actually private sector, where companies send representatives to some body like the IEEE to develop a new technology standard. Some are coming from government, but one of the problems is that most standard setting is just too slow. And I think we cannot afford to make too serious mistakes, because it may be very hard to come back from the mistakes once you have this degree of intelligence in the system.
Thank you. Rajesh, would you like to add anything about ethics and science, or shall we move on?
Yeah, just one broad point and one specific point. The broad point, I think I broadly feel that standards of a universal nature are, and that's what I think we just heard, are unlikely to really work. It's not something I think, it is very context dependent, and I think one size fits all, even within sectors, education, health, whatever, it's not likely to be effective or even achieve whatever it sets out to do. The specific point, the specific example I just wanted to, as an illustration, there was this recent thing in the UK, I believe, where the exams were, the high school exams were sort of cancelled, and people were graded based on their performance in the last year or so, and some algorithm did it in some very opaque way, and everyone was unhappy with the results, I think. But that's an example, I think, where it leads to a point I sort of made of science as method. I think we need to make judgment calls on some of these things, and this is where the scientists who develop the program should at least be able to, even if the programs then are autonomous of some kind and generate their own results in an opaque way, but at least should be able to say these are the limitations and these are the places where things can fail, and where we should trust it and where we shouldn't, and what kind of human intervention is necessary at which stage, and where the machine is going to do a good job. And so that balance between human intervention and the algorithms, I think, is something that the scientists can play a role in calibrating where exactly you place that. So thanks, yeah.
Yeah, the scientific view of the depth underneath the technology on the surface is absolutely critical to this.
Absolutely. Yep. So we have some interesting questions coming in from the chat. I'll group a couple of them together. We have one asking about how to incentivize the private sector. I would imagine that this is how we can incentivize the private sector towards working on SDGs, probably from either government-centered approach or from maybe just the private sector itself. And how can we encourage the attraction of more people who want to sustain our planet and address poverty, perhaps by pursuing, say, fundamental science, or by going into working in doing the kinds of things that Renata is doing. So maybe we'll start with the question about how we might think about encouraging the private sector to engage a little bit more in the SDGs or in the SDG related themes. Kicking it over to you, Richard.
So I think that one size doesn't fit all here either. There's a lot of incentives already floating around because there are many startup companies that are attacking the SDGs head on. And I think there was a business association that was looking at the economic impact of the SDGs and saw it as a $5 trillion opportunity between now and the year 2030, of which about 40% of the funding was going to be generated, the economic output would be generated in Asia. So I think that there's some incentives out there already. There needs to be more consciousness, awareness of the SDGs. That's a general education function, as well as something that we need to have just always in the media. And there needs to be an understanding that not every business plan fits the Silicon Valley model. There are plenty of really important things that a venture capitalist would never fund. And we need to explore alternative routes to financing. We need to explore the variations of fully, profit-driven company versus B corporation, the kind of social benefit corporation versus nonprofit organization, so that each idea can find its best vehicle.
Thank you. Rajesh, would you like to say something about how we can encourage more fundamental research, particularly in the context of India? I've got a personal interest in that as it relates to SDGs.
Yes. So I think the investment, it's historically been the case that whenever societies have invested in fundamental science, I think the return has been multifold. And of course, the returns are not necessarily over 5 years or 10 years, but this is something, of course, we need to think of as a species for the future. So mechanisms, and I think that was just alluded to, mechanisms of funding which are different from the usual venture capitalist mode, which maybe have a sort of a broader ban. I mean, right now, of course, governments fund a lot of the basic science research, but that could be expanded, and it could be a kind of a there could be sort of much more involvement of the big corporations, as well as philanthropists, in creating global funds, perhaps, which can support global research partnerships. Because I think very often we think, I mean, every country supports science in its own little community, but that comes often in the way of global partnerships. And some of the questions, and I just threw out artificial photosynthesis out there as something which is it's like a moonshot. You have to sort of aim for it, globally work for it. I think there are several centers around the world, I think, which are thinking of it, but the amount of resources devoted to it is, I think, very small compared to the potential payoffs of getting something like that working. And in India too, I think in India, we've been relatively lucky in that. I think the initial years after independence, the Indian government saw it important to invest in fundamental science, which actually has paid off in a number of ways, which were not very obvious at that time. In 1947, when the country became independent, the life expectancy was 32 years, and it was not obvious that you should be funding fundamental science. But the space program, India's strength in IT, and so many other things have its origins in that investment. And the space program has helped save lives through cyclone predictions. The IT program has driven the Indian economy. So clearly it's very important. And I think it's now time for India to scale up that investment. And I hope that will happen.
Absolutely. It's certainly a source of national and international pride. Renata,
Dinsha, yeah, could I just jump in there as well? Just in terms of incentive creation, I would say mainly for the private sector. It's not that there shouldn't be the other sectors involved. I mean, the public sector involved as well. But what I've seen is that in the countries where I've worked in, the SDGs and before them the MDGs, they have a lot of resonance, and I don't think you have the same resonance in the US or even Canada. But in many of the developing countries, there's an enormous amount of resonance with the SDGs. And so there's already an incentive by the private sector to want to be associated with them because they're viewed in a favorable light by society and by their customers. So that's one thing. Second thing is in the UN, we have something called the Global Compact. And the Global Compact is a peer-to-peer private sector sort of umbrella that brings private sector together to try to encourage amongst themselves the meeting of certain standards. And in those standards are corporate social responsibility. And now, of course, we've moved almost beyond corporate social responsibility because many in Asia, at any rate, many of the big companies they're not satisfied with just using some of their profits to funnel back into into society, particularly things like poverty reduction, etc. But they actually want to be engines of sustainability. They want to be part. They want their business models to be part of the solution. So I have seen the SDGs actually triggering some of this. So I would say that giving greater resonance to the SDGs, popularizing them more, and how should I say, socializing them more across society will in itself create an incentive for the companies. Because I think partly because of future business opportunities, partly because of the customer base demanding it. And also partly because, as Richard said, most private sector entrepreneurs or companies, even big ones, they want their work to mean something, right? They want it to do good, and they want to go home at night, with a feeling. One of my former bosses has called it psychic income. You go home with some psychic income, having done some good, and knowing that you've done some good. So those are other forms of incentives.
Very well said. Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists, especially our two joining us from India. It must be very late for you. I'll kick it back now to Anu. Thank you.